Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zelia Faria Costa, and I'm the Director of the Children, Youth, and Family System of Care at the Behavioral Health Services Department. It is my pleasure today, on behalf of the Behavioral Health Services Department, to welcome all of you for a talk with Dr. Bruce Berry. I welcome all the health and hospital system staff who are present today. We have folks from the Behavioral Health Services Department, from the hospital system, and public health. This is the fifth time within the last year that we welcome Dr. Bruce Berry to support efforts in our county around healing and traumatic events. The first time was back in May of 2021 after the VTA incident. Dr. Berry supported 2 additional listening sessions around the VTA and 1 meeting at the bridge for county employees. Today, we are marking in remembrance the 1-year anniversary of the VTA tragedy. We are processing and grieving additional recent traumatic incidents in our communities. We are grappling with the war in Ukraine and all that is happening there. And we are attempting to make sense of the most recent senseless tragedy in Uvalde, where 19 children and 2 teachers were killed. And all of this on the heels of other incidents in Buffalo, New York, and in Southern California. Dr. Bruce Berry's talks have been well received, and we welcome continued conversations about the impact of stress, healing, and building resilience. I just want to take a moment. I know that many of you are already familiar with Dr. Berry and his work. He is the principal of the Neurosequential Network and senior fellow of the Child Trauma Academy. His work on trauma and the brain has impacted clinical practice and programs and policy across the world. And most recently, we've actually started a neurosequential model site in Santa Clara County. His most recent book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing, was released in 2021 and co-authored with Oprah Winfrey. As Zelia mentioned, 1 year ago, our department reached out to Dr. Berry to seek his guidance on supporting our community in response to the VTA mass shooting. And he generously has spoken with our county and provided various support throughout this past year. So many people have shared how Dr. Berry's words have helped them and make sense of their experience, as well as helping them to support others. As I get ready to welcome Dr. Berry, I imagine many of us are looking forward to his words and messages about healing. I know with the anniversary of VTA and last week's Uvalde, Texas shooting, more than ever, we are wondering about safety and protection of ourselves, our children, and our loved ones, as well as our community. I hope that we are also holding questions about how we heal as a larger community, but also as individuals. Dr. Berry, welcome back to our county. Thank you so much for your time and your energy, sharing all of your knowledge and support of our healing-oriented efforts. And all, please join me in welcoming Dr. Berry. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. And I appreciate this opportunity to share some of our work with you and to have some opportunity for some conversation towards the end, because the truth is I learn a lot from doing these presentations. It helps me better understand some of these events. It helps me add to my catalog of experience. And in the end, it helps me help other communities as well. So thank you for the opportunity. I know that there are a lot of people on the call who may have been part of some of the other presentations, and to be quite honest, I don't know I never remember exactly what I talked about. So I'm going to act like everybody's kind of new to some of these ideas, and hopefully, if it's a revisiting, it will be viewed from a different perspective. And if it's completely new, it won't be too overwhelming. So I'm slide dependent. I'm going to show slides for the rest of the presentation. Those of you who want to, take one last look at my big head. This is what I look like. From now on, I'm going to be a little square on your screen. So Let me move over to my slides, make this big, and start with just the concept of stress. I don't think there's anybody on this call who hasn't used the term stress or who hasn't had some training about stress, distress, trauma. And I know you all know a lot about this, so I don't say these things to be in any way condescending. But what I want to do is just remind everybody that our body is filled with these systems, the respiratory system, our cardiorespiratory system, our GI system, our central nervous system. All of these systems in our body are continually active and are facing certain demands to try to help us survive and thrive. And these demands on all of our systems are really stressors. So when you get a little bit hungry, that's a stressor. When you have to get up and give a presentation, that's a stressor. When you see a new client and you have to struggle to understand what their challenge is and how you can help, that's a stressor. So we're continually exposed to stressors every day. And for the majority of the time, our stress response capabilities are able to activate, recruit the systems in our body and brain that need to help us address the issue. And then once that allows us to get back into equilibrium, those systems are able to rest and recharge. And the concept of rest and recharge, I'm going to come back to a lot, because in the face of prolonged stress, these systems don't have the opportunity to get back to this equilibrium state so that they can have adequate recharging. And the result is exhaustion of multiple sorts. And many of you have felt physically exhausted. Many of you have felt sort of cognitively exhausted. And all of these are absolutely normal for anybody who is experiencing a significant amount of prolonged stress or a set of extreme stressors, or when you're faced with a tremendous amount of unpredictability from day in and day out. So there's a lot of ways that you can activate your stress response apparatus that leads to adaptations that make us more vulnerable. And there are lots of ways that we can activate our stress response capabilities that make us more resilient and more capable. And the problem with the last couple of years is that for most people, COVID has introduced a lot more unpredictability, and it's been more prolonged than the stressors that the majority of us deal with day in and day out. And so as a result, most groups, most offices, most schools, most larger organizations have started to become permeated with a level of tiredness and exhaustion that has started to impair people's capacity to do the primary work of the organization. And so we've talked about this before a little bit, and I'm just going to touch on it. But the end result is that in a typical educational setting, for example, you really, the curricular expectations that you can have for a class are about only 2/3 of what you would normally expect you could manage with that same group of kids over the same period of time. The amount of academic productivity for an academic group is going to be less than it would have been over a comparable period of time. The ability of a system to bring in new ideas and the activation energy required to do that is just going to be too great for effective internalization of innovations. And so many of you who are in whatever system you're in have probably noticed that the introduction of novelty has been met with some resistance, a lot of it passive resistance, but sometimes active, angry resistance from staff. And part of this, I believe, is related to the impact of stress over a long period of time. And the dilemma that I think your community has struggled with, as have many communities, is compounded by other events that have had profound impact on the baseline level of, if you will, organizational regulation. Now, I can talk about this in a lot of different ways, but what I want to do is touch on a really nice slide that was prepared by Rachel 2 years ago, and in which she highlighted a number of the significant events that systems in your county were having to deal with. A couple of them were very, very, very overwhelming and very, very local. The Gilroy shootings, the VTA shootings, these had profound impact locally on multiple systems and throughout multiple areas in your county. And that, of course, is on top of all of the things that were going on with COVID. Now, there's an updated version of that we're going to spend a little bit of time with in a minute. But let me just, I want to just stop right here, start a new paragraph, and talk a little bit more about stress and a little bit more about the systems in our body that and brain in particular that are involved in modulating and regulating stress. And the reason I want to do this is that I want you to have some understanding of why some of the suggestions that I will make later on are why I'm making them, and why some of the things that you may be experiencing or you may be seeing in people you live and work with are taking place. I always think that if you understand the mechanism or what's underneath something, it helps you better understand and be innovative and proactive about the development of solutions. So let me back everybody up to a little bit of basic neuroscience about stress. This, and again, I don't expect you all to be neuroscientists, and this is a tremendous oversimplification of a lot of complex stuff. But let's take a look at just this very, very simple version of the brain. And in our model, when we're teaching and talking about the brain, we obviously it is not an upside down triangle. But we do think that this model helps capture a couple of things that are really important about the brain. One of them is that the brain has this hierarchical organization, and there are lower regions in the brain that mediate simpler functions, regulating your body temperature and respiration. And then as you get higher and higher in the brain, you get up towards the cortex and then into the cortex, where the most uniquely human functions, the most complex functions are mediated. And so speech and language and the ability to reflect on the past and anticipate the future, and creativity and all our capacity to tell time, and all of these really somewhat uniquely human functions arise from systems in the cortex. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is that stress is something that will exquisitely influence the efficiency and the effectiveness of the cortex. If you are stressed, your cortex is the first part of you that starts to shut down and become less efficient. And that has a lot of implications for thinking and planning and working and creating innovations and solving problems and all of the things that we're asked to do every day in our work. So this is a different version of that upside down triangle brain. And what we're showing here is we've got this circle here, it's in the CRN. What we're trying to illustrate is what we refer to as the core regulatory networks. in your brain, you have a set of neurotransmitter networks that are very, very important in many, many, many functions. And collectively, these core regulatory networks, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, and others, will reach every part of your brain and directly or indirectly reach every other part of the body. So the autonomic nervous system, the neuroimmune system, the neuroendocrine system, and a lot of you who've had Trauma 101, you've learned all about the HPA axis and cortisol, and you've learned about the amygdala, which is up here. But what I want you to appreciate is that because of this anatomy, because these core regulatory networks are able to get everywhere, they're uniquely involved in orchestrating our stress response capabilities. And so all of the monitoring of the outside world through our senses and all of the monitoring of the inside world through our interoceptive sensory apparatus send signals up into these lower parts of the brain, which then allow the core regulatory networks to turn on or turn off, depending upon the perceived optimal function to keep you alive and help you thrive in that moment. So under stress, certain systems will turn on and other systems will turn off. And if the stress is severe enough, if there's an external threat that activates these core regulatory networks and they start to activate the amygdala and certain cortical systems, and also start to deactivate other parts of the cortex and the higher areas in the brain, you get what we call a state-dependent shift in functioning. So clearly, this brain that has all kinds of things partially shut down and other systems significantly activated is going to function very differently than this brain that has all of these systems open for business. Under threat, you have a lot of your cortex that is not as effective or available in any given moment. And everybody's had some version of this that they can connect with. People who have had test anxiety, or if you've been in a conversation with somebody and gotten a little frustrated and couldn't remember the fact that was underlying your argument. And then when you're driving home or sitting on the train as you go home, the fact that you needed for that argument pops into your head and you go, oh, why couldn't I remember that? Well, you couldn't remember it because your cortex was shut down when you were all frustrated and angry. So key thing that happens is if you have your stress response systems, again, remember, the brain is malleable. These systems in our brain are changeable. So if you are lucky enough to have had a whole bunch of predictable, moderate, controllable stressors, your stress reactivity curve will develop in a certain way. And what I mean by that stress reactivity curve is how reactive are these core regulatory networks to external stressors? And if you are neurotypically organized and you've had sort of a decent combination of a good enough set of developmental experiences, and those systems are functioning normally, when you have a moderate stress, you're going to have a moderate internal activation of the systems in your brain that will be appropriately proportional to the external challenge. However, if you have had lots of chaos and threat and unpredictability, you're going to get completely overwhelmed by the tiniest little challenge. And where you are on this curve can change. So you may be a neurotypically organized person, but then you have all kinds of opportunities for moderate, predictable challenges, and all of a sudden, you may, over time, develop the capacity to demonstrate resilience. In contrast, you may be faced with a whole variety of unpredictable, overwhelming, and prolonged stressors, and your neurotypical regulation will start to decay. You'll become more sensitized, more reactive. And I can guarantee you, if you think about people you know that you've been working with, you can think of examples of people who for whatever reason, have been struggling, and you can trace it to prolonged, uncontrollable, extreme stressors in their lives. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this is that your capacity to sort of demonstrate resilience, as I said before, is malleable. So if you're lucky enough to have meaningful work and have secure income and secure housing and good cultural connections and all of these things, this connectedness and all of these other elements of safe, stable, relational connection increase the probability that you'll have moderate stressors and you'll have lots of people around and lots of circumstances that will allow you to get back to equilibrium. So when you're stressed, you'll be able to get regulated. When you're overwhelmed, you can get regulated. When you have a rough day at work, you can go home and get regulated. And this leads to really a form of privilege. The reality is, many of us were privileged to come into the last 2 years being pretty well organized so that we could demonstrate resilience. But I would argue that because of what's been happening in the last couple of, the last couple of years, what's happened is a lot of people who were pretty well regulated, over time, their capacity to demonstrate resilience started to decay. And I believe that, and again, I don't have time to go into this, but one of the most important things about our work and the work of many others is the demonstration of what we call relational contagion. So when you work with a group of people, their emotional state begins to influence you, and your emotional state begins to influence them. And so if a community begins to experience lots of instability, lots of unpredictability, lots of loss, lots of distress, pretty soon the collective, the group climate in the workplace starts to go from calm and regulated to a little bit tense and dysregulated. And it can get to the point where it will temporarily dip into dysregulated. And I would suggest that when the VTA shooting occurred, many systems were literally globally dysregulated. And it may be, and over time, it's possible that that started to get better. And then there's an event that tips off some people in the office, somebody they knew, maybe related, this may have been something that for many people destabilized the recovery process. And then there's an evocative local shooting. And then there's news on the national news. And then there's Uvalde. And it may be, and again, I'm only speculating, different offices and different environments will have a different pattern. But what I want you to think about is, can you trace for your working group a plot like this? Can you do that? And furthermore, as an individual, can you think about have there been any losses in your family? Have you or people in your family had any health issues? Have there been any behavioral health issues? Have you been impacted more because of the COVID isolation? And so everybody will have an individual, if you will, map on where they are over these last couple of years. And some people may have, with the VTA shooting, become incredibly dysregulated, but then they had all kinds of positive help, and they got reconnected to community, and they had good organizational policy about help, and then they were doing fine until the Uvalde shooting, and now they're going to have a struggle for a month until they quit watching the news, and that passes. And so everybody's got a different pattern. But the bottom line about this is that if you're here, this is changeable. Many of the people who started over there are now typical. You may have started out 2 years ago in that resilient, really able to manage a lot of stress and distress. But after 2 years of unpredictability, you're finding yourself just pretty normal. And some people may even be struggling and have moved over into this area. Now, many of the families that we work with and many of the individuals that we work with, through no fault of their own, again, they've experienced all kinds of destabilizing developmental experiences that have pushed their stress response capabilities over in this direction because they have had community, family, cultural experiences that have resulted in more unpredictability, more prolonged challenges, more extreme challenges. And again, we can talk some more about what these look like. But if this is where you started this 2-year period, it's highly likely that you're over here now, that you're have more needs and you're much more vulnerable. And I think if you look at the data about anxiety and depression in school children and the workforce feeling overwhelmed in many places, and the difficulty recruiting and retaining educators and people in other frontline fields, I think we're feeling the effects of the shift in this resilience curve, if you will. Now, the question is, how do you get this back? How do you start to create opportunities for individual healing? And the answer is you can. The good news is you really can. But it's hard. The key is you have to start to increase the number of predictable, moderate, and controllable stressors in your both individually for yourself, but also if you're thinking about an organization, you have to think about what are the organizational things that we can do that will increase the opportunities for people to feel that they're in a safe, stable environment where their work challenges are moderate, where there's more predictability about what we expect of them, where they know what to expect, and where they have more agency, where they have more controllability over what they do day in and day out. And this is what a lot of the thoughtful organizational planning should be around, is how do we create this process where individually and as an organization, we sit down and we go, all right, what can we control and what can we not control? Because one of the biggest dilemmas when something happens, when there is an environment where people begin to get dysregulated. So over here, by the time you're over here, one of the things, let me just draw this right here. When you're here, your cortex is open for business. When you're here, your cortex is partially shut down. And when you're right here, your cortex is basically shut down. So people in this state don't do good planning, don't do good thinking. People in this state tend to do kind of primitive thinking and primitive planning. And let me see, I don't know if I'd have to pull up a different set of slides to talk about this, and I might do that in a minute. But what I want the team leaders, supervisors, administrators to think about is that the first task when you are trying to deal with a group of people who are right here, including yourself, is that you have to think about how can we restore some regulation? How do we create an opportunity where people who are feeling dysregulated now begin to feel more regulated? And we do have some ideas about that. We do know that if you have structure, and again, obviously this may not be family meals, but if you have opportunities for exercise, if people feel connected, if individually people are acting on some of these things, that will increase the probability that this curve will shift in the right direction. In the beginning of COVID, what people were doing was there was no structure. People were eating too much. They're watching media all the time. They felt isolated. They were negative and ruminative. And this is kind of where watching the media about Uvalde and going on and on and on about whatever the issue is, I can guarantee you there's probably very few people who are listening who have actual, are going to be able to change federal policy about guns right now. It doesn't mean you shouldn't think about what you can do in a concrete way about voting or about spreading it, sharing information about things. Those are actionable things you can do. But the kind of sort of ruminative stuff that gets fed by press, in the end, consumes energy and dysregulates people. This is why sometimes the water cooler conversations can escalate in a workplace around things that are not actionable, around speculation, around who does this, and the office gossip actually has a role, but if it is too much and too intense, it can have a really destructive impact on a workplace. Let me go back to this. So one of the things that I think is worth spending a little time thinking about is if within your own organization you begin to think about, can we as a leadership group just create our organization's trajectory through the last 2 years? How were we calm and regulated, at this point? When COVID started, did we start to get dysregulated? How did the shootings impact our organization specifically? How are we handling these evocative cues? Are these impacting our workforce and the people that we're supposed to be caring for in ways that we're not aware of? And then if you do have an opportunity, one of the things that is worth thinking about is giving people opportunities to learn a little bit more about actionable items that will increase the number and frequency of predictable, moderate challenges, as opposed to these unpredictable, extreme challenges. Now, one of the most important things about this unpredictable versus predictable aspects in a workplace is communication. If employees in an organization have major changes or even minor changes just popped on them without any pre-warning or any sense that they had a voice in a change in direction in practice or policy or hiring or anything, that the sense of being out of control is magnified. And again, this is why I think transparency is a tremendously powerful tool in helping take the inevitable stressors of work. you are never going to be able to get away from stress. Everybody whatever system you're working in, stress is a key part of it. And you will never be able to get rid of all of the unpredictable or extreme stressors. The idea is to minimize and not be a participant or a contributor as the leader in an organization to the unpredictability, to the lack of control. And so when you can be inclusive around decision making, when you make a decision, inform people why you made the decision. When you are about, if you have to make a decision without any advisement or any input from the people you work with, tell people why. Give people an understanding about where this decision comes from. And I think the more that you can make something known as opposed to unknown, the more you're going to help people be regulated and increase their capacity to move from a more sensitizing to a more resilience building experience in the workplace. Now, let me stop sharing for a second and first of all, look at the time. You know, I want to make sure that we have opportunities for some conversation and back and forth. So, Rachel, have there been comments or questions that have come up?
Yeah, we do have 2, maybe 3 questions.
Okay. Let's see what we got here. And
I think one of them factors into what you were just speaking to. Would it be all right if I ask it now?
yeah, please. Yeah.
So someone is thinking about the history of adverse childhood experiences, and I think the accumulation, right, of trauma, adversity on top of one another, that each time there's a new crisis, right, depending on your vulnerability, you're going to be responding in a different way. And I think just if there's anything further you want to say to that, both on I think thinking about it organizationally, which you've spoken to, but also on an individual level, if there's anything further you want to add.
Yeah, let me add this.
Okay.
I'm going to share my screen again. And so this is sort of tangential to the question, but I'm trying to, hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is how important connectedness is in global health. And one of the things that we know is that developmental adversity, increases your risk for struggles, whether they're physical health, mental health, social problems. But we also know that your history of connectedness actually is capable of counterbalancing your history of adversity. And this continues all the way through life, that the best predictor of your functioning in any given moment is how safe and stable your connections are with other people. Are you connected to community, culture, family? These things have the elements that protect us from stress and duress, and they also create the environment that allows us to heal from past trauma. And so what I'm trying to illustrate here is that let's pretend that this is, I'm going to have to draw here. Let's pretend that right here is birth, and these are different individuals. And here's an individual who early in life had all kinds of unpredictability and chaos. And so the pattern of activation of this person's stress response system was all over the place, and it led to this increasing sensitization. And then at some point, with individuals who are like this, you can intervene. You can sort of either take them out of that environment, or you can start to provide a variety of therapeutic opportunities. And by therapeutic opportunities, I don't mean necessarily therapy. It could be that this person was a really good athlete, and they ended up becoming part of a team and having success as the, because of their skill set. And then they learned how to form relationships, and these relational opportunities with teammates and coaches provide therapeutic opportunities. And so what we know is that once you have an opportunity for the introduction of therapeutic opportunities, if you have high connectedness during that, the rate at which you heal is faster. The other thing we know is that if you don't have a lot of adversity, but you have low connectedness, you end up being less resilient than if you have high connectedness. So basically, the more you have opportunities to be connected to healthy family, healthy community, school, culture, community of faith, all of that stuff, these are really protective factors. And then when a catastrophic event takes place, everybody is sort of vulnerable temporarily. And then while this happens, you've got this shift where some individuals may end up getting super threshold on atypical and then having clinical symptoms, and others will have what looks like regressive regression in progress they've made, and then others will literally they will feel distressed and overwhelmed, but it will not be such that it overcomes their existing capacity to demonstrate resilience in the face of stressors. So what I would say is that to the degree that you are aware of the adversity that somebody that you've had or somebody you know has had, that will be an important variable in how they're able to manage the last couple of years. There will be some people who this collection of events is so overwhelming that it swamps their somewhat fragile capacity to cope. And this is kind of what we've seen, is that if you look globally at the normal curve, that everybody's capacity to deal with things, and you think about it as a normal distribution, the entire curve has been shifted as a function of COVID. And there's very, very few people who are better off by virtue of the last 2 years. There may be some, but most people have felt pretty disconnected, overwhelmed. Most people have experienced in real life the devastating impact of being disconnected from people you love and care for. And this is something that we've been trying to help to try to use as a teaching point for many people who previously had a hard time understanding what we were talking about when we were talking about relational poverty for kids in foster care, for example, or what we were talking about in terms of how vulnerable somebody who is an immigrant might feel when they're away from their family, their community, their culture, and they are an outsider and don't feel quite like they belong. This is the feeling of the marginalized kid in school. All of these relationally disconnected states are somewhat echoed by people's experiences with this sort of physical separation that we've all had, at least in the beginning part of COVID. And so I guess my message is that you want to be particularly sensitive to people who have had developmental adversity, who have any of these other vulnerabilities. And I would urge people to be as incredibly flexible and patient with these folks as possible. I think this is, we've heard a lot of sort of unfortunate stories about people that want to just get back to business as usual, and they're very impatient and intolerant of the different journeys that different people have back to normal. And there are going to be some people that will be able to kind of get back into a normal work routine pretty quickly. But there will be some people where it might take a year. And I think that you really should let them take as much time as they need and be as supportive as you can. Because in the end, if you are, you will have a harder working, more loyal and member of your community, I think, than if you discard them. The other thing I would say is that everybody is, if you are in an organization and the leadership discards people and minimizes and treats them poorly, everybody sees that, and that contributes to a feeling of dysregulation that will make it harder for everybody to come back to normal. So the more you demonstrate kindness and compassion and flexibility and understanding, the more you will make the people in your environment feel safer, and the quicker they'll become more productive, and you'll be able to sort of meet the mission of your organization better by being kinder.
I think another question in relation to some of the things that have happened in our county, there's been a number of efforts. We have a Gilroy Strong Resiliency Center, the VTA Resiliency Center. We've been providing mutual aid during the fires last year in Santa Cruz. We've had town hall sessions, listening and support sessions. I think all around, right, trying to increase connection and increase opportunities to build relational health and resiliency. Those are just a few, but I think how we remain present and how we continue to support the community, particularly when we're in roles of helping others. When events keep happening and happening, while the last event feels raw, it's raw for the helper as well, and the community is still trying to heal. The question is really around, how do you help yourself and how do you prepare to be present? How do you support the community when you're still kind of navigating some of the things yourself as a helping professional and as just a person experiencing all of these various events themselves?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest dilemmas we have, I mean, we're seeing this in Uvalde, right? We're doing some work there, and the people that you would normally recruit to be part of the healing community are themselves so overwhelmed that they're not capable of being that fully present, regulating, rewarding, healing presence. And when that happens, you have to think about going outside of that community to get other kinds of supports. And I always think about these events sort of as a bullseye, basically. There's the ground zero where the people who were directly there, who had children who were killed, who witnessed the murders, and then there's the kids who are in the school, and then there's the families of the kids who are in the school, and then there's the first responders. A lot of them would be in the inner circle as well. And so in a community that's as small as theirs, the dilemma is you cannot find somebody in that community that isn't within the first three circles of impact, which basically means there are not people in that community who are going to be able to be 100% consistently energized to help others. And so two things, the result of that are two things. One is those people will get tapped out and drained out quickly, and their response, they will continue to either try, and because they're not able to be fully present, they'll be relatively ineffective. And the second thing is that a lot of these folks will try and then get so exhausted and then disengage. And through all the first three circles of response, there's going to be an increase in depression, anxiety, drinking, everything else. Now, frequently, if people in those communities are able to get help from external sources, transiently even, that can help them. But as we've learned over the years, this is a long process. You know, the irony of anniversary reactions, right, as you all are experiencing right now, is it may have been a year ago, but as you get closer and closer to the anniversary, it gets more and more raw, more and more overwhelming. And the reality is, after the first anniversary, you've only had one anniversary experience. And for the brain to kind of get used to experiences, it takes 5, 6, 7, 8 repetitions. So you're going to have profound anniversary responses in many people all the way out to 10 plus years. And this is completely to be expected. And the more you tap out people in your community, the less capable they are of managing this, the longer the recovery period is. So because that community has been so pervasively impacted, and because they are physically isolated, and the people that they're going to draw on to help shore them up are further away, the recovery period for that community is going to be much longer than a community that was, like, for example, Sandy Hook, and which is still a recovering community. But they had so many more people proximal. And so they had more people that could draw on who were not directly impacted by, you know, who weren't in the inner circles. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling. I don't know if that makes sense, but the advantage of your county is that it's very big. And so that there are people who were impacted, but may not have been as directly impacted as some of the people in these inner circles of the bullseye, who can then give some of their energy and effort and regulation to help in the process. And that's invaluable. And even when you do have that, it takes a lot longer than most people appreciate.
I think I'll just pause to see if there's anybody from the group that wants to raise their hand to ask. We probably just have time for one question. And if there is, we'll go ahead and prioritize that. And if not, I have maybe 2 more questions, maybe 1 more in the chat. Is there anybody that would like to ask a question directly to Dr. Perry? Okay. I think being a parent, this past 2 years with COVID, and thinking about your children being in school and are my children safe from a health perspective, has definitely been one that's on parents' minds. And with the Uvalde shooting last week, by thinking about the safety and protection of your children at school, it's really hitting very, very core to really anybody that's a parent, where you have to entrust your children to the care of somebody else and to a system. And so the question that's coming in is thinking about how as a caregiver, do you, what are thoughts about supporting young children as they're asking, you know, very realistic questions about their own safety and whether they're protected when they're out of their parents' care?
Yeah, I think about how heartbreaking it is that we even have to ask this question. Yeah. First thing I do is, just for all of you, I would recommend anybody who's interested in this issue read Children Under Fire, a book by John Woodrow Cox, a Washington Post reporter. It's an incredibly good book about the impact of school shootings on children, and not just because he looks at the surviving children as well, the witnesses and the kids in the school and all of that stuff. One of the points he makes in there, which is very sobering, is that in the United States, more children die from gunshot wounds than active duty police officers or active duty military in the United States. And now I don't know the time period he's talking about, but I think there was like it was a several year period that he was tracking, but that's pretty sobering. So here's what I would say is that there are actually quite a few really good places where people have written books or posted materials that will help you talk to children about some of this stuff. And in general, my recommendation about this is to continue to reinforce that school is a safe place. You know, that your teachers and the principal and the parents are going to take care of you, and that this is a safe place. And because despite all of these things that happen, statistically, it is a safe place. And I think that it's important that children go to school feeling safe. I mean, I think one of the most disorganizing and sort of challenging aspects of those active shooter drills in school is that they're very, very dysregulating and probably have more negative impact than positive impact on kids. And again, John Woodrow Cox talks about this in that book. But you know, one of the things that we have to do this all the time. We have to reassure kids that getting on planes is safe. We have to reassure them that getting on the bus and going to school is safe. We have to reassure them about all kinds of things that have risk, but overall, the intention of all of the adults there and the safeguards that have been put in place are going to make this safe. Because the last thing you want is a child who's completely risk averse, overwhelmed and anxious about going to school or about any new place or any new thing, and that overwhelms their capacity to benefit from all kinds of developmental experiences. And you know, it's a you know, we have a lot of debate and a lot hopefully of civil conversation and that should be ahead of us as a society to change some of these things. Even like you know, I see a note here about these code drills. These things were all developed with good intentions. But part of what we have to be better at is developing practice elements in education, mental health, child welfare, all the systems we're in, where we actually gather data while we're doing our work. And once we get the information that says the direction we're going in is good or it's bad, we can change. So for example, now that we have the information that the majority of active shooter drills, the way they're run, are ineffective and dysregulating for kids, let's think about a different way to teach educators how to do, you know, prepare for these events. And you know, that there are people that are thinking about this and trying to do that, but we have a lot of discussion to take place. And I think that we, you know, we're at sort of a sad place in our culture right now where we have, you know, I was sitting down, I was asked to write an op-ed for the Washington Post, and I started writing it, and I went back to the first shooting I was asked to be involved in, and it was in 1998. And if anything, it's gotten worse. And I just, it's a pretty demoralizing realization that, you know, despite everything that we've been learning about trauma and everything we've been learning about, you know, gun violence, and that the situation is actually worse. So I think we have to keep plugging away. And I know I've gone past time, so I apologize. And but I appreciate the opportunity. Despite all of this stuff, I am hopeful. We are a problem-solving species. I think as long as we remember about the power of connection, that we'll be able to reweave our social fabric and get to even a better place than we were before.
Thank you. And thank you for staying a couple of minutes over time with us. Definitely appreciate it. And yeah, just your continued support, not only for our community, but really so many around the world. I think that's one of the things that creates hope is individuals like yourself. And I think so many people that are part of this talk today that are putting bits of good and connection into the world. And I know for that, I'm just so incredibly thankful to you and really to all of us that are doing this good work.
Thank you all. And remember, you can't do all that good work unless you take care of yourselves.